well, let's go ahead and get started so we don't short you from any time for this next panel that will be talking about the effects of Black Sea turmoil. And we referenced a little bit about that in the previous panel, but it's going to be an exciting conversation, and we're so pleased to have Ambassador Kip Tom here to serve as our moderator. Kip is the CEO of Tom Farms LLC in Leesburg, Indiana. In addition to all of his activity on the farm and with Indiana agribusinesses, he's also was serving as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations agencies for food and agriculture and chief of the U.S. mission for the UN agencies in Rome from 2019 to 2021. And I have to say, I think Kip is kind of a tireless ambassador, even though he's no longer fulfilling that role. He recently hosted the Director General of the FAO at his farm over the weekend with a lot of agribusiness leaders, and so he continues to be a great ambassador for all of us in American agriculture. At the same time, he's also been an advocate for modernizing American agriculture, digitizing, and increasing sustainability in order to enhance the U.S. objectives in foreign policy and all of our agricultural priorities. He's also chairman of Global Ag, an ag consulting firm. So again, I'm really pleased to welcome Kip up to the stage to moderate our next panel. Please join me in welcoming Kip Tom.
Make some brief remarks before we start having the panelists up, but I'll start out by saying that I don't think any of us in this room 4 years ago would have predicted we were at where we're at today. After serving as the U.S. ambassador in Rome, we actually ran the second largest budget next to NATO, worked globally, worked over 140 different countries. And we had humanitarian organizations we dealt with, the World Food Program, who just during my time there, we saw their budget go from just shy of $6 billion to today is probably going to be somewhere between $13 and $14 billion. So we haven't done much to solve world hunger in the meanwhile. We've seen trillions of dollars spent to stimulate the economy during the pandemic. We've seen global supply chains interrupted around the world. Starting in China all the way through Europe and the United States, and the effect of inflation. We see misguided policy in Europe and sometimes the United States in regards to food and energy, so intertwined together. So we've got a lot going on around the world, and then we get to the place where we now have the war in Ukraine, bringing a whole nother dynamic to it, followed up with a drought in Europe and droughts across the United States, Kansas adversely impacted, obviously. So there's a lot going on around the world, and I really look forward to our panelists this afternoon to give us a little more insight from their perch of how they see this going. So thank you again, Sarah, for that kind introduction. And I'd like to first invite up Daniel Whitley. And Daniel's going to give a few remarks, and then we'll get the other panelists up here as well.
Thanks, Ambassador Tom, and thank you all for having me. Sarah, thank you, and everybody else. This topic couldn't be more timely and important. In 50 days, on November 15th, the global population will reach 8 billion people. Now, we've all heard about the urgency of the global population reaching 10 billion people by the year 2050, but the urgency of 8 billion people signals to me that the time is now for the global agricultural community to act. That's why I want to begin by saying I think one of the most important weeks USDA has ever had was the announcement of the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. I think that will go down as being a game changer in the global agricultural community. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But on to food insecurity. It's very easy to point to the war in Ukraine as the primary driver, and it is a major factor in global food insecurity. But the reality is there were a lot of other factors prior to the war in Ukraine. Obviously, the pandemic and COVID certainly played a really big role in terms of global food supplies and reaching the world's most vulnerable citizens. Obviously, the supply chain disruptions severely impacted the ability for our largest ag producing countries to meet the needs of global demand. Okay? We also had issues with poor policy responses once the war broke out. You heard Seth Meyer, chief economist at USDA, speak a little bit earlier and talk about the Indonesian palm oil ban on exports. But there were also bans coming out of Argentina for wheat, coming out of Argentina on soybean oil, exports as well as bans. There were some poor policies in India on wheat. So there were a number of poor policy decisions that really exacerbated the crisis and the food insecurity crisis. Now, obviously, there was a lot of concern globally, and we worked in a number of international organizations. We worked bilaterally with the Ukrainians, but we also worked within the U.S. government to come up with a response. What can the United States do? What can USDA do? And what must the global agricultural community do to help alleviate some of the strains on the global food systems? So we came up with a number of things, and I want to highlight a few of those. First, the USDA, we signed a really big, important MOU with Ukrainian Agriculture Department. This MOU allows us to continue to work with the Ukrainian ag industry on issues as they arise. Right now, we're partnering with them on technology to help mitigate any potential animal disease outbreaks. You're in a war-torn region. You're in a region with very little security of what happens in the very next second. Just a few minutes ago, we talked a little bit about bombs hitting parts of Ukraine earlier today, okay? They didn't know that was going to happen. So animal disease outbreaks is a very big concern. So we're working with the Ukrainian ag industry on being able to mitigate some of these concerns. We're also working with them on SPS training. We're working with them on animal and plant health and all different types of technical assistance that we can provide right now. But we're also pledging to be part of the solution as the situation moves forward. Okay? We're helping them with systems to try and export their commodities. We're helping them with systems on storage. And all of USDA, many agencies are involved in dealing with this response. Now, in terms of working in the global community, I want to highlight two things that were already underway, but we think submit what can help alleviate global food insecurity. We have our AIM for Climate initiative, and we have our Coalition on Sustainable Productivity Growth. And I highlight the Coalition on Sustainable Productivity Growth is because what we're advocating for in USDA and American agriculture is that we can be responsible citizens and grow products sustainably, grow products that bring down greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions, but yet still meet our responsibilities. And that's what we've been able to do in our approach to addressing these issues. Now, we've got some friends across the Atlantic who have a different approach. Their approach hadn't worked well. It's not working well. We've already seen them reverting and moving away from what they were advocating for prior to the war, which tells me if it's not good in a time of crisis, is it good at all? Okay? So we're advocating and doubling down on our approaches to be sustainable and to make sure we meet all of our needs. Now, back to the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. Say a few words and want to make sure I'm respectful of my other panelists and leave time for them. When this conversation first began, some of the early predictions were we might get 50 proposals for $1 billion in funding, 50 proposals. We got the 50 right. We missed the 1,000. There were 1,050 proposals totaling $20 billion for $1 billion in funding, which to me underscores the strong and what I think is the best public-private partnership anywhere in the world between USDA and American agriculture. And if you would have asked me this question in November, when I was here in Kansas City for the National Farm Broadcasters event, when I tell you there was a lot of reluctance when it came to sustainability and climate change, there was no way you could have convinced me that we would have 1,050 applicants to partner with the USDA on moving forward in the global conversation on climate change and sustainability. So nobody is more excited than me about what all of you have done and what American agriculture has done to meet the challenge and show leadership. And I say leadership because this is a global conversation. This is a conversation that we have no choice but to win. Make no mistake about it. There's a voice on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean that pretty much opposes a lot of what we all say, a lot of what we all agree on. There are voices on the other side of the world who want to say, if you don't do things how they do things, they want to import your products. That is the challenge of the moment we're facing. So with that, I want to say thank you again for having me, and I want to leave time for the other panelists. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Administrator Whitley. I know in my work around the world, we always went to the Foreign Ag Service offices, and your global footprint that you're in charge of, it's a lot of responsibility. So thank you for your service to our nation and the consumers around the world and in advancing American agriculture products. Really appreciated. Really look forward to your insights here this afternoon. Next, I'd like to invite up Christine Cochran. She leads SNAC International with responsibility over direction, strategy, and management. And as the president and CEO, she oversees the group's work across 3 pillars: education, advocacy, and networking. Prior to SNAC International, she served as executive director for the Grain Foods Foundation, and prior to that, she was a Commodity Markets Counsel, first as Vice President for Government Relations before being named the group's president. Christine holds a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University Law Center and a bachelor's degree in agriculture economics from the University of Missouri. Please help me in welcoming Christine.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here. Before I dive into my very brief comments, I want to just thank Sarah, Bob, and Erica for having me today. The last bit that Kip led off with was that I was a University of Missouri alum, and so, you know, as an undergrad, the idea of being a speaker at the Kansas City Agribusiness Council was like a dream, and now it's, you know, I'm 46 and living it. It's great, and I brought my mom here to help me celebrate that. So just so you know, it's real for me. Super happy to be back here, super happy. But let me just for 1 second, one of the things I've really loved about the conference today is the commitment and the agenda to expand your perspective. And I kind of see my role here as also one of those added elements to expand your perspective. So there's been a little bit of conversation about CPG. So right here, I'm your face for CPG. At SNAC International, we're a trade association that represents snack manufacturers. And so from a brand perspective, you're going to want to think about things like Doritos and Goldfish and Slim Jims, but also you need to understand that we're an international organization. So we're also companies like Barcel. We are around the world, 400 plus members. We include the manufacturers of the snack foods, but we also include the ingredients, the packaging companies, the equipment manufacturers, the entire gamut there. So we have been very much affected by what's going on with the Ukrainian war. And so just to highlight, to circle back to the topic at hand today and talk a little bit about that and what that has meant as a snack manufacturer. So with COVID, like with every business, especially manufacturing businesses, we saw an increase in costs across all of our inputs. With the onset of the Ukrainian war, for those of you who don't know, Ukraine exports about 46% of the world's sunflower oil. Sunflower is incredibly important to snack manufacturing because it is neutral in taste, it is low in saturated fat, and it's non-GMO. From an allergen perspective, from a non-GMO perspective, it's a gift, right? So it's on the packaging of every single product that it's in. And that was at the heart of our problem. So when access to oil was altered, while there may have been substitutes available, the challenges we had from the supply chain of acquiring film, the packaging for the snack foods, to adjust the labeling was almost impossible. So prior to the Ukrainian war, access to packaging took about 2 weeks-ish, depending on what you were looking at. It is now at, the last time I asked someone, which was earlier this month, 20 weeks. So when you want to pivot your ingredients, but you have labeling requirements, it's very, very difficult to do. And you may have noticed I mentioned that it was neutral in taste and low in saturated fat, which means you're a food manufacturer, you can work with the federal government under some of the COVID exemptions. But one of the other labeling components that you see on a lot of snack foods is the non-GMO piece. That is not a government label. So if you want to change your label or include an ingredient that maybe is no longer compliant, now you're dealing with a third party. So even if you could get the packaging and you want to make the changes, you have a lot of organizations that you're having to negotiate with as you as a company work to make those changes. So when we talk about food inflation, and I think Seth did a wonderful job of kind of characterizing the cost components that some of these companies are managing, and 16%, I think he said, were input costs. He's absolutely right. The rest of them are some of these other issues, like can I get corrugated? Can I get my film? If I can get it, what are the other entities that I have to negotiate with? So what we saw as manufacturers is what was highlighted in the last panel as well. It's just been very much lived for us, is that the supply chain was already fragile. And what the war in Ukraine did was take a fragile system and further degrade it. And so while you had a lot of companies double down and make investments, especially in things like digital technology, to streamline some of their supply chain disruptions that they were getting based on what was happening in the Ukraine, the other piece that you had that was persistent was labor and transportation, which are more domestic-focused issues, but very real. So again, just at every step along the way, from a supply chain perspective, as a manufacturer of a food product in the United States, it was continues to be hurdle after hurdle. And so, today we're talking about what are the ripple effects from that, and I'm really excited to hear your questions, and hopefully we've seeded some conversation here for later in this hour. But the other piece that I would encourage you to think about too, especially as you start to frame your questions and you listen to everyone else on this very esteemed panel, is that of ESG. And what the commitments are that companies not only have made, but intend to achieve. And they are both at the shareholder level for publicly traded companies, they're in financing agreements, and then they're from overarching government bodies as well. So all of these for us in snack manufacturing converge and create an incredibly dynamic, disrupted environment for manufacturing and feeding America. So with that, I will conclude, but look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Christine. Just make sure that supply chain for Cheetos stays open. That's all I care about. Just keep the Cheetos in the marketplace for me. So our wrap-up panelist is going to be Arlan Suderman. Arlan Suderman is the Chief Commodity Economist for the StoneX Group and FCM division, a financial service provider for global markets. Arlan oversees the company's commodity market intelligence efforts. He provides unique market insight on global macroeconomic trends and their implications for the commodity markets. Arlan is a veteran analyst. He previously stint includes senior market analyst at Water Street Solutions, and as a market analyst for Farm Futures Magazine and FarmFutures.com. Arlan started his career with the Kansas Extension Service, developing educational programs focused on crop production, marketing, and risk management. And he's a graduate at K-State University with a degree specializing in animal science and industry. So please help me in welcoming Arlan Suderman.
Thank you, Kip. Well, I did graduate from Kansas State, but Sarah hired me anyway once upon a time, even though I didn't graduate from Iowa State. But I'd say on Saturday, one of us was a lot happier than the other. It was back in 1992, June of 1992, so a little over 30 years ago this summer, that I had the privilege and honor of working with Senator Dole's office to set up a farm visit for then President Boris Yeltsin of Russia in south central Kansas. And it was a very memorable day. Boris Yeltsin addressed the crowd after he ran the combine almost through a barbed wire fence. He's not a very good driver of a combine. But he addressed the crowd and he said, the wheat that you grow here that we're harvesting today came from my country. And he said, your yields are 3 times what ours are. But we are investing in our agriculture. We are making it a priority. We are putting agriculture on the top of our priority list, and we will overtake you and become the breadbasket of the world. Now, back in 1992, all of the former Soviet republics together, that'd be Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all the stands, was it 12 or 14, I think, 14, I believe, members of the former Soviet Union, produced 78 million metric tons of wheat. They imported 23 million metric tons of wheat. This year, Russia, depending on which estimate you believe, produced between 95 and 99 million metric tons, up 25% from last year. We'll have about 54 or 55 million metric tons of exportable wheat. Because of sanctions and other policies and stuff, they probably won't be able to export more than 40 to 42 million metric tons. But they have certainly turned things around, just as Boris Yeltsin had said. And when the war broke out, Ukraine and Russia combined, just those two members of the former Soviet Union, accounted for 29% of the world's wheat exports. They truly had become the world's breadbasket. And that's where the war broke out. And they were able to, President Putin of Russia was able to leverage food and energy as a weapon to get other countries to try to support him, and let alone the fertilizer that comes from Russia and Belarus. So a significant factor impacting the entire world. Our fertilizer production is very much concentrated as far as exports coming from various countries, certain countries, not as widespread in production as what we'd like to see. So over the last 50 years, we've been moving toward, and this kind of backs up what you heard a little bit ago, we've been seeing demand grow for a long time. Over the last 50 years, if you look at global corn production, or global corn supplies, let me say, they've been in decline, trending lower when you look as a percent of annual usage. The only blip in that trend was some years back when USDA upwardly adjusted supplies in China and accounting for supplies there. But the overall trend has been down for the last 50 years as we've been moving toward being a world with just-in-time supplies. We could get what we wanted when we wanted it from just about anywhere in the world, and so the world became comfortable with just-in-time supplies. Ukraine really changed all of that. We had some production problems in various parts of the world, yes, but suddenly trade changed depending on whether you were supportive of Russia or not supportive of Russia, whether you're a supporter of Ukraine or not, and all of a sudden who you did business with changed. Freight lines tend to go along levels of efficiency, and suddenly they change to who could you do business with and who would you not do business with. And so sometimes freight lines are changing. We had over 100 ships that were tied up for many months in the ports in Ukraine, finally being able to leave now under the Safe Corridor Passage agreement that achieved. That is at risk once again of not being extended once we get to November. So that could create a significant problem. But if you're a friend of Russia, so to speak, doing business with Russia, maybe the freight lines are longer than otherwise they would have been. If you're not a friend of Russia, but you were buying grain from them, now you're buying grain from elsewhere, longer, less efficient freight lines, increasing the cost of freight, taking longer to move things. So it's totally changing the dynamics of global trade. Now, within Ukraine, with the war battling on there, you saw the map earlier that Seth put up, Dr. Meyer, that showing the fighting's been primarily in the east, although we've seen missiles fall all throughout Ukraine at various times. And most of the core production would be in central and eastern parts of Ukraine. That's where it's heavily concentrated. So a lot of the agricultural area has been impacted directly by where the front lines are at. So this year we saw total grain production in Ukraine, where we have a number of our customers, fall by 34%. And it's anticipated that it's probably going to fall at least another 20% next year. Financing is getting increasingly difficult. We heard mention of the kamikaze drones that attacked port facilities in Odessa today. About 15% of the storage facilities for grain have been damaged severely or to some extent making them hard to use through this war period already. And that continues to be a factor as Russia targets grain storage facilities. And infrastructure as well, sheds containing farm equipment they will target. Anything they can do to try to stop Ukraine from producing grain and exporting it. Now they have the safe corridor passage, but it's really not in Russia's best interest from their standpoint to allow that to continue. I've been really surprised they've allowed it to go on as long as they would. I figured it was a matter of time before that they would accuse Ukraine of cheating and find a reason to shut that down. And that's what seems to be happening now, is the cheating part. So the question is, whether they do shut it down or not, how long will shipping companies feel safe sending a ship into the docks in Ukraine, not knowing if all of a sudden everything will get shut down and they won't be able to get out of there, be trapped once again. So that's a legitimate concern. Insurance rates are very expensive coming out of there. We've had, as of this morning, 218 ships that have left Ukraine carrying grain and products. Those are mostly small, handy ships, 22,000 metric tons. So not the big Panamax ships that can move large volumes. Some of that's because of where they're going and the port size of where they're going, but also it's not as easy to maneuver through the safe corridors with the big ships, or shipping companies aren't as comfortable with the big ships either. So we are seeing limited exports. If you look at what goes out over land to the west, Ukraine's rail system, the rails are a few inches wider than the European system, so everything moving to the west they have to pick up the car, put a new undercarriage under it, or else they have to unload the car and reload it into another car that can fit on the European system to go west. That slows things up. They are making progress. Initially, they struggled to get 1 million metric tons per month over rail to the west. Now they're getting that number up. They're 1.5 to 2 million metric tons, and we think they're going to get efficiencies up there to get up to 3 million metric tons per month going west over rail to the border and then to the Danube River and to ports in Romania, etc. So they are making progress on that. But as far as moving things through the ports, that still remains very limited, and the question is how long that'll be able to continue going forward. If the war were to stop today, it'll take years to rebuild the agriculture there, the infrastructure, and it'll take us a significant amount of support from the West financially in order to do that, a tremendous investment in order to do that. So much has been destroyed, the economy is really hurting. The Ukrainian people have been amazing. Their resiliency, their desire to fight, their desire, even the fact of what they were able to produce this year, even though down 30% from last year, is absolutely amazing and a testament to the spirit of those people. When you consider that they were oftentimes working in the fields trying to work around unexploded mines or missiles that landed there in their fields and stuff. absolutely amazing. Some of them, as the front line had moved their way and they couldn't get their wheat or barley harvested, they would set fire to the field so the Russians couldn't have it. It's just something that we can't comprehend in a difficult time, and it affects all of us in the world in many different ways. And I would agree with some of the statements that were made by previous speakers. What we're facing today goes much more beyond Ukraine, but Ukraine was an additive factor to that and continues to be. So with that, I'll conclude my comments and give us the opportunity for some of your questions to really address some of the things that matter most to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arlan. Appreciate those comments and all three of you. I'm going to start out. My first question is going to be to you, Daniel, but I want to tee it up, set the scene or paint the scene for the audience here. So we know the European Union has the Green Deal Farm to Fork initiative that they're trying to advance, get totally passed within the EU Union, the 27 nations. But at the same time, they want to advance around, they want to export their policy around the world. We know that the Farm to Fork initiative will lower productivity around 11% if accepted around the world. We also know it will increase cost of food upwards of 80% if adopted around the world. At the same time, we've got nearly 350 million people in 85 countries that are hungry, that we're trying to create resiliency and capacity in farming systems in those countries, but yet we've got the EU trying to export this policy into those countries, these developing nations, countering U.S. initiatives there to try to increase productivity, and with a very negative narrative. At the same time, we have the war going on in Ukraine. Ukraine used to be the breadbasket because of logistics supporting the Sahel of Africa with the wheat needs that we had there at the World Food Program. And all this drives migration. We're seeing increased migration and human trafficking up through Eastern Europe and out of Ukraine into Russia right now. We're seeing some of that. We're also seeing some of the Sahel population move into Central America and come in the United States. These people would really rather stay home. They'd rather have food at their own disposal at home. They'd like to do it themselves. They'd like to have their own economy where it's strong. They're tired of living that cycle of subsistence farming and barely getting by. So my question to you is this, Daniel. When you look at the EU Green Deal Farm to Fork initiative, and as they're trying to promote this around the world, you know the outcome, as we just described, is that information comes from USDA ERS. When you look at that, what are you doing as an agency or at the Foreign Ag Service in your efforts around the world to counter that effort by the European Union?
No, great question. And the first thing is, the first phone call I received when the war broke out was from a colleague from the European Embassy. And the first question they asked me was, hey, is USDA taking a second look at the Conservation Reserve Program? I said, no. They said, well, we're taking a second look at our programs because we think we may have to bring marginal land in production. To me, that was an admission that the Farm to Fork does not work and will lead to greater food insecurity around the world. So what we've done is we've had unprecedented dialogue with Europe, and we've established some initiatives like the Consultative Partnership on Agriculture. So this is an environment where we're going to educate them on our approach to production agriculture. We'll talk about some of the things that you just mentioned, but the bottom line is if we fail to arm global producers with the science, technology, and innovation needed to meet the challenge, we will never feed those 10 billion people. It will never happen. We don't have a choice but to make sure all of our farmers and producers around the world have access to these technologies.
Well, thank you. I know on Saturday we have the FAO Director General Q Dongzhu, three of his Deputy Director Generals, his Chief Economist at the farm, and on official visit, and really tried to showcase U.S. innovations and technologies and what role that could play around the world. And granted, it won't be widely adopted early on, but there are portions of it that could be, just even hybrid genetics sometimes along the way, right, or even the use of fertilizer or crop care products, or just knowledge, right, is what seems to be the most lacking. So, like I said earlier, we can't continue to expect the World Food Program to continue to do the humanitarian efforts, right, and we need to help these people create their own resilience and capacity building.
Absolutely. And when we have conversations with European farmers and producers, many of them agree with us and they want access to science, technology, and innovation. But they have no choice but to be protectionist if their own governments aren't giving them those options.
Christine, I'll go to you next, and you know, listening to your open remarks and everything, and obviously this panel's focused on the Black Sea, correct? And I realize part of your supply chains have been challenged, mainly on the sunflower oil. You know, I don't know, I think jury is still out on what that production looks like this year. I did talk to the CEO of Syngenta, Eric Fearwald, the other day, who's in China right now, but he said that their total sales in seed and crop care products in Ukraine, mainly focused on that sunflower crop, was nearly 90% of their budgeted expectations from last December. So that gives me some hope that those supply chains will help you meet your needs. But when you look at your business, I look at the challenges, and it leads into this Farm to Fork initiative. If the people in Europe had their way at Farm to Fork, they would see the snack food industry go away. And I challenge each one of you in this room, take the time. It's a 30-page executive summary of the EU Farm to Fork initiative. Take it and read it. If you want something that really discredits the U.S. agricultural production system, it does it in there. And I suggest you read it because it's the challenge that they're trying to export to the United States, and we're already seeing some of it with Proposition 12 in California. So my question to you is this: how are you countering the narrative that is starting to bleed into the United States? And obviously, we know you have supply chains that they're dependent on you to buy their product, right? So how do you counter the narrative that we're seeing start to emerge in the United States about nutrition and some of the different food products that we consume?
So I have to use this because I made a poor clothing choice. Let's see. So I'm going to actually talk not just from the perspective of SNAC International, but I'm actually going to talk from my previous position as well, heading up an organization called the Grain Foods Foundation. So let me spend just a little bit of time here. The conversation around nutrition and especially coming from Europe, you need to understand when it comes to nutrition policy, the United States is not a leader. We are a follower. And so what Kip is referring to is real. And the push from Europe of the Farm to Fork has been going on for over 10 years. My entire time at the Grain Foods Foundation, I took that post in 2012, was spent working around this. When I moved over to SNAC International, it just continues, and we have the White House conference coming up later this week, where we will see this also play out as well. So at SNAC International, one of the things that we like to talk about in that nutrition narrative space is that food isn't just for medicine. It is. It can be, and it can do a lot of amazing things, but it's also cultural. It is very important to people's identities, and we need to acknowledge that as well. And so one of the things that we like to talk about is the expanding portfolio of what is snacking. It's classically, we think of it in America as the potato chip, but if I'm sure everyone in this room has been down the snack aisle at the grocery store lately, and you know that it's no longer just the potato chip. You see culture reflected there. You see habits changing. You see portion control. You see ingredient diversification. You flip over the bag of Calbee's Harvest Snaps, which is a Japanese-based company that has established operations here in the United States. And you see a snack food that is definitely better for you, right? It has some fiber, it has some protein, its sodium is relatively low. And those are the types of products that we are seeing innovation in. The other thing you see is in the bar space, where a classic one to talk about would be like a Kind bar, a Cliff Bar. These are market leaders. They've both offered up smaller portion sizes. I think Cliff calls it the mini, or maybe kind, don't quote me on that. Maybe it's the kind mini. But my point is that the consumer is able to find a product that is convenient for them, fits their nutritional needs, and has a touch point with some of the other more emotional reasons for eating, like culture. And I think we can't, like, that is just so incredibly important. And one of the stories I always like to tell is about the cornflake. And I feel good talking about that because Kellogg's is not a member of SNAC International. But cornflakes, for me growing up, that meant a bowl of cereal on the breakfast table in the morning. In my time at the Grain Foods Foundation, I learned that that was not the case for everyone. If you were not growing up in Southwest Missouri, in growing up in other parts of the country, the cornflake was very culturally significant in other meals. So it would be the topping on a casserole, or it would be, it was consumed in a lot of different ways, put into cookies. And we have immigrant populations who come in, and it's the only food in the grocery store that they may recognize. These are all very real moments. And so it's easy in the nutrition space to maybe look at the cornflake and say that it's not as nutritionally sound. But the reality of it is, like, for some populations, it's a very important part of their diet, and across a balanced diet, it definitely can fit. The other thing I would just add in there too is a plug around what American food producers have done around nutrition. So not only have they worked to reduce some things like sodium and sugar over the last decade, but you also can't discount fortification in our foods as well. And so I'm a big advocate of what has happened over the many decades around enrichment and fortification of foods. It's stemmed a lot of public health crises here in the United States that we don't even think about. But when you look at, like, the food fortification initiatives around the world, it's really, really powerful and important.
Well, Christine, thank you for everything you do there. I know in some of the forums I've been participating in here in the last year or so, we are really looking at agriculture in a much different light today. We're calling it a food system, right? So people look at agriculture and they look all the way to that consumer health. In fact, they go as far as to say food is health. So in saying that, now all of a sudden you've brought up a certain part of this audience that's in that conversation is saying, well, we spend X on food, but we spend 2X on food-related diseases. And to my point against that would be, well, yeah, maybe we are preparing our meals in 11 minutes now or less for that family. It's usually very highly processed food. We're not spending the time providing some of the nutritious foods that we need to. But the thing is, we've got a very sedentary lifestyle anymore. We see kids that are on their iPad or their iPhone. They're not out playing a baseball game like most of us did after dinner, or had chores or baling hay, whatever it was. Very different lifestyle today. So food is health, but there's other contributors to where that health goes besides that we consume. So along with that reading that I gave you of the EU Green Deal Farm to Fork Initiative, read the Eat Lancet Report 2.0. That'll even scare you further on where some of the different nations around the world are really trying, and NGOs are trying to push food systems. Arlan, my next question is going to be for you. Having worked with a number of NGOs in Ukraine myself over the past 6 months, trying to work on some alternative channels to get grain out of Ukraine, which we've moved a little bit and making some headway there. But some of that's been slowed down a little bit. Now we can't get barges on the Danube River any longer because the Germans are paying a premium to ship coal up to make sure they have power this winter. We know that the Russians have been stealing Ukrainian grain, moving it out ports. Some of that's hard to track where that's going. We are suspicious, obviously, and I'm sure you can lead into that answer to that as well, Daniel. But it's tricky for Ukraine right now. Where are they going to get fertilizer in 2023? We know typically it came out of Belarus and Russia, nitrogen, potassium. Maybe they got their phosphorus out of China, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of challenges financing that credit that they need. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we saw it so important to make sure we saw those supply chains open to move that grain out so the farmer had cash to buy. We know that fuel is an issue, repair parts, working in a field that's got a mine in it. But how do they produce, or what do they produce if they don't have access to fertilizer or credit? I'm interested in your comments.
Yeah, it really changes farming when you're talking about farmers on the tractor in flak jackets trying to protect themselves, and it adds a whole new dynamic to what it means to feeding the world. Certainly the challenges are there, and it's been impressive what they've done. A lot of the farmers are in the war effort as well, because everyone's trying to defend their country. So it does make for some challenges. As we look at this next year, I think it does kind of reshape what they grow, looking at those crops that are going to be of highest value and the lowest risk. So wheat is one of those crops that is easier to grow, so to speak, with lower inputs, lower fertilizer requirements, because being able to get fertilizer into the country is more challenging. Finding new sources for that fertilizer, less fuel requirements, etc. And they are going toward more oil seeds as well. Again, less fertilizer requirement than what we see for corn, for example. And it's easier to process and move the oil seeds out. So that should help with the sunflower oil situation. They're learning how to move more of it west into Europe. Whether that's going to be able to go through the export channels to get here to the United States is another question. That may still become a challenge. But they are just being creative and looking at those oil seeds and wheat that lower the amount of inputs, easier to produce, less times out in the field putting yourself at risk, quicker and easier to harvest and get to market. And that's really the goal. They're seeking those efficiencies to do what they can. The export program, a big part of the export program, was to really help farmers finance the next planting of the crop. Get enough exports out to do that. And beyond that, then you're looking at raising revenue to help defend themselves as a people. And that's something Russia doesn't want, and it's going to continuously try to restrict that. But that's what the Ukrainian people are trying to do to defend themselves. I was speaking on this one day in one organization, actually, as a client group, and I had someone come up to me afterwards from Ukraine, it's personal to them. It really is. It's easy for us to sit up here and talk about it, but to her it was personal. So it's about survival and finding the best way to do that, and that includes being able to produce something that they can sell to raise money.
Well, thank you, Arlan. Daniel, any comments on that?
I agree. I think that there are a lot of unknowns when it comes, but I do think that there are instruments and systems in place that the U.S. government are a part of to make sure that Ukrainian agriculture has the tools and the support it needs to be successful when we get on the other side of this situation.
Well, we know that Putin fired some shots across the bow here in the last week, saying that just looked like this Ukrainian grain was just going into Europe, not into the developing world where they were having humanitarian issues. The reality is we know that at the same time the Ukrainians, to make sure they were competitive against the Russian wheat, were lowering their export tax, and I don't believe Putin liked that at all. So maybe that created some of that competition there and some threats against us having that. I do know also that some of the companies buying the grain that were exporting it were having issues getting their value-add tax credits back from the Ukrainian government, which I'm sure you're aware of too. So it's complex. It's complex. So let's take a few questions from the audience. So one of them is, and whoever wishes to answer any one of these questions, which nations will most effectively expand wheat production in response to the market disruptions caused by the war? Anyone?
Well, wheat is, as they say, wheat is weed. It's easy to grow. So it's grown in many different parts of the world. And here in the United States, to start right here, we'll see an expansion of production. And if you change the weather pattern and start raining in the plains, we'll increase wheat acreage dynamically. Right now, when you're looking at a crop insurance revenue guarantee of around $8 for hard red winter wheat for this next year, that's going to be a lot of incentive to put wheat in the dust and hope the bins will bust. If you can just get one good rain to bring it up and get it established, and with the amount of crop failures that we had in the plains this summer because of the drought, the ground is certainly there. Right now we're working with the figure of maybe 7% expansion in an area. That could work up to 10% or more if we could get a change in the weather pattern and get some moisture. Australia is going to have a big crop this year. They've got the incentive to expand. They've done so, and they're getting the rains, particularly in eastern areas of the country, to do so. Argentina wants to increase its production. Now, this is something to keep an eye on because until this point, GMO and wheat has been hands-off in the world. And Argentina is pushing the envelope on that. And they're trying to build in, since they've been in multi-year drought situation, they're using GMO technology to build in drought tolerance in their wheat. And so they are pushing the envelope, trying to get the world to accept it. And some countries are starting to do so now, and doing so at a time when supplies are tight in the world is advantageous to Argentina. And the whole world is watching whether they succeed in this or not, because that would be a huge change in world acceptance of GMOs in wheat. And so they're making far more progress than I anticipated that they would, and that would allow them to increase production. They would like to become a much bigger exporter of wheat if they are successful at doing that.
Daniel, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I would agree with everything he said, but I would add Canada to that equation. I think there's an old adage which is proven to be true in all the countries he named. The solution for high prices is high prices. And you'll see in these countries farmers be able to receive the price signals to encourage production. And so we see what he's mentioning over there, but along with Canada. And I think we'll see a big response to address this crisis and chase some of these higher prices and profits that are out there to be gotten.
You know, Arlan, you opened up Pandora's box here on GMO wheat. So, you know, I feel we're still growing my grandfather's wheat yet today, his genetics, right? We've seen GMOs, how they can affect productivity around the world and lessen actually our carbon footprint. But, you know, I look at you, Christine, and I look at the markets you're in. Will the consumer accept it?
I'm going to go with the I don't know answer. It's tough, right? I mean, I've been on both sides of this issue, and especially as it relates to wheat, I think there is a lot of reason for Argentina to do what they are doing, but whether markets will accept it, in terms of trade, and whether the consumer will accept it is to be determined. There are a lot of initiatives out there trying to educate the consumer, and I think you're seeing some movement there. But when you introduce genetically modified wheat into, let's be frank about it, wheat is in our staple products, right? It is in the bread, it is in the pasta, it is not just in snacks. And so those are frequently consumed, especially in the United States. It's something to do with care. I do think some of the new technology, which might allow you to move away from the label of GMO, but still get some of the benefits, the agronomic benefits, that is probably the path of least resistance.
Thank you. Well, we're into our lightning round now. We got 5 minutes left. I'm going to give one question to each one of you. Daniel, the United States and the world depends on Russia and Belarus for potassium and nitrogen. We know a low-cost source of natural gas in Russia, but we know we got sanctions. We know that some of that nitrogen is finding its way around the world. And one thing we said at the Department of State oftentimes is sometimes we, in the globalization of our supply chain, we have put our short-term prosperity ahead of our long-term security. And I look at us dealing with countries like Russia on fertilizer, Belarus, or China on phosphorus. What are we doing trying to bring back those supply chains back in the United States?
USDA announced a $500 million fertilizer program to reach out to American agriculture and all of our farmers and producers to give us the best ideas out there. And my understanding is that we'll have some announcements coming out very soon about some of the ideas and the approaches that we're going to partner with, but it's that American agriculture leading innovation, leading solutions to some of the world's problems. And I have to throw a plug in for what our land-grant colleges are doing. There is amazing work going on in our land-grant system, and Iowa State is on the cutting edge of seed technology. They are measuring the usage of fertilizers and coming up with solutions that can perhaps save about 33% of the fertilizer we're using currently, as it is an over-application of fertilizer. So through our land grant system and through our partners that we hope to get a lot of education on with this $500 million fertilizer program, we're going to come up with solutions to help diversify our reliability on Russian and Belarus fertilizer.
Thank you. Arlan, so as we look at Europe, we know there's an energy crisis there, right? We know that they've throttled back their own nitrogen production, obviously because of the EU Green Deal, but then at the same time, availability of that natural gas to produce nitrogen. So now the U.S. is exporting nitrogen into Europe. Aside from that, how do you see the energy crisis impacting Europe over the next 6 months during the winter, and what will the implications be to Ukraine, the United States, and others around the world?
Well, I'd say the bigger question is, if we've seen peak inflation, everything's going to be more stable in 2023, and I think the canary in the coal mine is, how does Europe get through the winter? How does this all play out this winter? What's the supply of natural gas? Now, some of the things governments have done is to put a cap on prices for energy, and I understand politically why they did that, but historically that then fails to ration demand as we need to, and results in shortages. If we see natural gas prices and supply really tighten up this winter, shut down urea production, and not only that, natural gas is a major feedstock for the farm chemicals we need in order to produce crops, and much of those are produced in Europe. And so that could have a big impact on the availability and price of crop inputs in the Northern Hemisphere this next coming season. If they get through the winter fine, have a mild winter, and able to get through with the reserves of natural gas that they have, then I think we may have seen the worst behind us. But the one forecast I've seen for Europe for this winter, and it's early, and God gave us weathermen to make market analysts look better, but it called for below normal temperatures for December, January, and February for Western Europe. And that spells trouble. That'll be a problem. And so that could mean a lot more volatility and maybe inflation pressures in 23 if that plays out.
Christine, one last question for you. So we know that there's obviously an energy crisis around the world. We've seen alternatives come into the marketplace, whether it's on the biodiesel side or the ethanol side, renewable fuel standards. What's SNAC's position concerning those programs?
We are strongly in support of alternative fuels. The industry is committed to Scope 3 emission standards. As I mentioned in my remarks, sustainability across the entire supply chain is of foremost importance. And I can say that to you coming off of our Executive Leadership Forum earlier this month, where we spent a substantial amount of time as an organization listening to and discussing what those initiatives are and what the impact is. So while the businesses are very focused on managing the supply chain issues, none of the other business priorities have been delegated or relegated, I should say. So please know that those are still very much at the forefront.
Thank you. And I know we're at the end of our time here, but Daniel, I got one question for you. Do you see challenges from the World Trade Organization or other countries around the world with our Climate Smart Agriculture Initiative? Do they see that as trade distorting?
I'm sure there are probably some members of the WTO who may see it as trade distorting, but I think that this is clearly a program that starts with research, starts with innovation and technology, and seeks to garner information. And there are mechanisms under the WTO dispute settlement body chapter that allows for this type of research and innovation. So hopefully it doesn't get to that.
Thank you,
The WTO
Daniel.
isn't functioning anyway, so not really sure if it can, they can do it.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all three of our panelists for all their comments this afternoon. Appreciate it. Hopefully it was enlightening to you, the audience here. And let's give our three panelists a round of applause.